Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the Mokele-Mbembe, a name that hums with the ancient secrets of the Congo basin. We are traveling deep into the emerald heart of Africa, a place where the air is heavy enough to touch, and the trees grow so thick that the sun only reaches the forest floor in fleeting, golden splinters. Close your eyes and imagine the humidity. It is a warm, constant embrace, carrying the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the sweet, heavy perfume of flowers that only bloom in the dark. The river moves beside us, a slow, winding ribbon of obsidian water, whispering secrets against the tangled roots of ancient mangroves. This is the realm of the Mokele-Mbembe, a name translated from the Lingala tongue to mean the one who stops the flow of rivers. But before we find the creature itself, we must look at the marks it left behind, the very first evidence to reach the Western world. We go back in time, away from the hum of modern life, to the year 1776. While across the ocean, the drums of revolution were beating in the American colonies, a quieter, more profound discovery was being recorded in the heart of Africa. A French missionary named Bonaventure Proyart was documenting the wonders of the Longo and Congo kingdoms. He was a man of faith and a man of observation, a scholar of the natural world who sought to categorize everything he saw. He wrote of the people, the customs, and the vast, impenetrable landscapes that seemed to defy the maps of the era. But in his records, there is a passage that stands out among the descriptions of exotic birds and tall grasses. It is a moment where the known world ends and the impossible begins. He describes a series of tracks found by his brothers in the mission, deep within the tangled, prehistoric greenery of the forest. Visualize the scene with me. The missionaries are walking along the edge of a dense thicket, the ground beneath them soft and yielding from the seasonal rains. They are used to the footprints of the forest. They recognize the heavy, rounded pads of the elephant, the distinct, divided marks of the buffalo, and the deep, four-toed impressions left by the hippopotamus near the riverbank. But these tracks are different. They are truly immense. Proyart writes that they were 3 feet in circumference. Imagine a circle of that size pressed firmly into the dark mud. It is a footprint so large that a small child or even a man could sit within its boundaries. And most startling of all were the claws. These were not the flat, blunt nails of a pachyderm. They were sharp, distinct claw marks etched into the earth with terrifying clarity, deep enough to suggest a weight that is almost difficult for the human mind to comprehend. The soil had been displaced with such force that it told a story of a creature that belonged to an age long forgotten. The arrangement of these prints provided even more detail to the stunned missionaries. They were spaced 7 to 8 feet apart. As the men measured the distance from one step to the next, they realized that the animal was not in a hurry. It was not running from a predator, nor was it chasing prey. It was simply walking. Imagine a leisurely stroll for a being of such magnitude, moving through the undergrowth with a heavy, rhythmic grace. Proyart noted in his writings that the posture and disposition of the footprints suggested a monstrous scale, something that far exceeded the proportions of any animal known to science at the time. In 1776, the concept of a dinosaur was entirely unknown. The word itself would not even be coined for another 65 years. To these men of the 18th century, it was a beast of biblical proportions, a titan of the swamps that defied every known category of the natural order. Why did this discovery cause such a quiet stir among those who eventually read Proyart's accounts? It was the sheer contradiction of the physical features. An elephant is large, certainly, but it does not possess claws that could leave such sharp, rake-like marks in the mire. A hippopotamus is heavy, but its feet do not leave a 3-foot impression, nor does it step with a stride of 8 feet. This was something entirely new, or perhaps something ancient that had never truly left the shadows of the basin. The missionaries stood in the humid silence of the jungle, looking down at a physical map of a creature they could not see. They were standing at the edge of the unknown, where the veil between the modern world and the prehistoric world is at its thinnest. The tracks led toward the deep water, disappearing into the reeds where the river begins to slow, and the mud becomes a thick, dark curtain that hides the secrets of the depths. Think of the silence that must have fallen over that missionary party as they stood over those prints. The jungle around them, usually so loud with the chatter of monkeys and the calls of tropical birds, would have felt suddenly vast and predatory. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of the tall grass, would carry the weight of that 3-foot footprint. They were looking at the first ripple in a pool of mystery that would eventually draw explorers, scientists, and dreamers from every corner of the globe. This was the moment the world first heard of something in the Congo that did not fit the rules of man. It was a ripple that started small, a few lines of ink in a missionary's journal, but it was destined to grow into a legend that refuses to die. As we settle deeper into the night and the air grows cooler around you, let the image of those ancient tracks fade into the darkness of the forest floor. Know that the journey into the swamp has only just begun, and the shadows are waiting to tell us more. The year was 1913, a time when the world was expanding its maps, but the heart of the African continent remained a dense, green mystery. Imagine the thick, humid air of the German colony of Cameroon, where the sunlight barely touches the forest floor. We leave the tracks of the missionaries behind and step into the boots of a soldier and an explorer. Captain Freiherr von Stein zu Lossnitz was a man of discipline and detail. He was commissioned by the German government to lead the Likuala-Congo expedition, a massive undertaking intended to survey the land, the rivers, and the life within them. But as the captain moved deeper into the wetlands, the official nature of his mission began to shift. The mechanical sounds of survey equipment and the rustle of paper were soon overshadowed by the hushed voices of the people who lived along the riverbanks. They spoke of something that did not fit into any biology book in Berlin. The captain was not a man given to flights of fancy. In his official reports, which would later be kept in the shadows of archives for decades, he wrote with a clinical, almost detached precision. He described a region where the rivers Sanga and Ubangi twist through the landscape like dark ribbons. Here, the water is tea-colored and opaque, hiding whatever moves beneath the surface. As he interviewed the local tribes, he noticed a recurring pattern. They weren't just sharing legends. They were providing consistent, anatomical descriptions of a creature they called Mokele-Mbembe. The captain listened, his pen scratching against his journal as the evening insects began their rhythmic humming. He noted that the fear in their voices was genuine. This was not a spirit to them. It was a physical presence, a neighbor that demanded a wide berth and a deep respect. In his report, von Stein described the beast as having a body that approximated the size of an elephant, or perhaps a large hippopotamus. But it was the neck that set it apart from anything known to science. He wrote of a long, flexible neck that could rise out of the water like a serpent, allowing the creature to scan the banks from a distance. Its skin was described as smooth and brownish gray, a color that would allow it to vanish into the muddy shadows of the river bends. Imagine the Baron sitting in his tent, the lantern light flickering against the canvas, as he tried to reconcile these descriptions with the world he knew. He was looking at a creature that seemed to belong to a prehistoric age, yet it was being reported as a living, breathing threat to the local fishermen and their wooden canoes. One of the most striking details in the Baron's secret report was the mention of a single horn. Some of his informants described a long, sharp tooth or a horn protruding from the snout of the creature. This detail has long puzzled those who try to categorize the Mokele-Mbembe as a dinosaur, yet it adds a layer of terrifying specificity to the Baron's account. He also documented the creature's preferred habitat, the river caves. These are deep, underwater hollows carved out by the current at the sharpest turns of the river. The thought of such a massive animal lurking in a submerged cavern, waiting in the cool, dark silence while the world above bakes in the tropical heat, is enough to make anyone pause. The locals told him that the creature was strictly vegetarian, feeding on a specific type of liana that grew near the water, yet it was incredibly territorial. It would attack any boat that dared to enter its stretch of the river, lashing out with a powerful, muscular tail. The captain's expedition was cut short by the tremors of a different kind of monster. In 1914, the Great War erupted across Europe, and the colonial borders of Africa became front lines. The official botanical and zoological records of the Congo expedition were never fully published in their time. The barons' detailed descriptions of the elephant-sized reptile with the swan-like neck were buried under the weight of military reports and casualty lists. For years, his observations remained a secret known only to a few officials and later to researchers who sought out the truth behind the legends. But the silence of the archives could not erase the stories. The baron had seen the fear in the eyes of the river people, and he had seen the strange, huge tracks that didn't belong to any elephant. He left the jungle with a report that suggested the world was much larger and much older than the maps of the 20th century cared to admit. As we think of the baron today, we see a bridge between the ancient world and the modern one. He was a man of the 1900s, yet he was documenting a ghost from the deep past. His writings invite us to look at the river not as a path of commerce, but as a sanctuary for things that have forgotten to go extinct. The water continues to flow through the Likwala swamps, washing over the entrances of those hidden caves, keeping its secrets safe from the sun. The baron's report serves as a whisper from a century ago, reminding us that even the most disciplined mind can be humbled by the shadows of the jungle. As the current of our story carries us further, we must wonder how many other reports lie forgotten, and what other eyes have watched from the safety of the reeds as the explorers passed by. As we look back at those early years of the 20th century, we see a world caught between the rigid certainties of the past and a new, wilder hunger for discovery. In 1919, as the dust of the Great War was only beginning to settle over Europe, the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, District of Columbia, prepared to send its own emissaries into the unknown. This was not a small venture. It was an ambitious 32-man expedition, a collection of some of the finest minds and most rugged explorers of the age. They were led by Edmund Heller, a man who had already seen the far corners of the earth, but who now turned his gaze toward the deep, shadowed heart of the African continent. They carried with them the heavy, brass-bound cameras of the Universal Film Manufacturing Company. The heat in the Congo Basin is a physical weight. It is a thick, humid presence that clings to the skin and makes every breath feel like a deliberate choice. For the men of the Smithsonian expedition, the journey began with a sense of immense, scientific purpose. They were there to catalog the world, to collect plants and animals that had yet to be named by the academies of the West. But beneath that layer of professional duty, there was a whisper of something more ancient. The rumors of a monster, a creature that the local people called Mokele-Mbembe, had already begun to filter through the ivory trade and the missionary outposts. The researchers were skeptics by nature, yet the sheer vastness of the river system seemed to invite the impossible. They moved slowly, their fleet of boats carving a path through tea-colored water. 6 days into their journey along the riverbanks, the atmosphere shifted. The dense walls of green foliage seemed to press closer, and the chatter of the birdlife would occasionally fall into a sudden, expectant silence. It was here, near the muddy edge of a slow-moving tributary, that the guides stopped. They pointed toward the soft, gray clay of the shore, where the water had recently receded. There, pressed deep into the earth, were tracks that defied every category in the researchers' manuals. These were not the rounded, familiar prints of an elephant, nor the chaotic churn left by a hippopotamus. These were distinct, massive indentations, nearly 3 feet across. The men knelt in the mud, their white linen shirts quickly staining, as they ran their fingers along the edges of the prints. The tracks appeared to have 3 distinct toes. To look upon such a mark is to feel a shiver of the prehistoric. The researchers took their measurements with trembling hands, noting the depth of the stride and the way the mud had been displaced by a weight that must have been truly monumental. In their logs, they wrote of footprints that were 3 feet in circumference, marks that suggested a beast larger than anything currently known to walk the earth. The light of the late afternoon sun hit the tracks at an angle, casting long shadows into the depressions and making them look like craters on a miniature landscape. There was a sense of profound confusion among the scientists. If this was a known animal, it was one of a size that challenged the laws of biology as they understood them. They spent hours sketching the strange shapes very carefully. As evening fell over the camp, the visual evidence was replaced by something even more unsettling. From the direction of the unexplored swamps, a sound began to rise. It was a roar, but not one that belonged to a lion or a leopard. It was a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to come from the very throat of the earth itself. The guides grew quiet, their faces illuminated by the flickering orange glow of the campfires. They knew that sound. It was the voice of the one who stops the flow of the rivers. The Smithsonian team sat in their canvas chairs, listening as the sound rolled over the water, a low-frequency rumble that they later described as having no resemblance to any known animal. It was a primal noise, a reminder that they were merely temporary guests in this land. The search for the Mokele-Mbembe reached a fever pitch as they prepared to move deeper into the territory. But the search is often a story of near misses and sudden endings. For this group, the end came in 1920, not from a monster, but from a tragic accident. While traveling by rail, their locomotive suddenly derailed, turning over in a chaotic tangle of steel. 4 team members were lost, crushed in the wreckage, and many others were left with broken bodies. The expedition was shattered. They returned to Washington with sketches of footprints and stories of roars, but the physical proof remained behind, hidden in the mud of the Congo. It was a false start, a tragic beginning to a mystery that would haunt the 20th century for decades to come, leaving only questions and the memory of the tracks. The jungle closed its gates once more. The air in the Likwala Basin does not simply sit. It weighs upon you like a damp, heavy velvet. As we move further into the heart of the Congo, the rhythmic pulse of the water against the hull of our small craft becomes the only clock we follow. The search for the Mokele-Mbembe is a journey through a landscape that feels older than time, a place where the line between what is seen and what is known through the bloodline begins to blur. Here, the riverbanks are crowded with the ancient roots of the mahogany and the mahogany's shadows. To understand the creature we seek, we must listen to the people who have shared these waters for centuries. Their voices, carried on the humidity and the evening smoke of the villages, tell a story that the Western world only began to glimpse in the middle of the 20th century. These are the oral traditions, the living maps of a world where the water hides a giant that the rest of the world has forgotten. To the local tribes, the name Mokele-Mbembe carries a weight that syllables alone cannot describe. In the Lingala language, it is often translated as one who stops the flow of rivers. Imagine a creature so immense, so physically substantial, that its mere presence in a narrow channel acts as a living dam, turning a rushing current into a stagnant pool. Some of the Baka people use a different cadence, referring to it as the river shutter. To them, the name is a warning. It is not just a description of size, but of power. It is an entity that commands the very element they depend on for survival. In other dialects, the word is whispered as a synonym for mystery or even a rainbow, reflecting the way the creature is said to appear and disappear with the suddenness of light through a storm. There is a profound reverence in these names, a recognition that the river has a master, and that master is not man. During the 1950s and 1960s, as the outside world was preoccupied with the dawn of the space age and the tremors of global politics, the villages along the riverbanks held onto a different kind of reality. In 1955, When missionaries like Eugene Thomas arrived in the region, they found that the stories of the beast were not distant myths, but contemporary facts of life. The village elders would sit by the fire and speak of sightings from 1946 and 1948 as if they had happened only yesterday. They described a creature with a body as large as an elephant, but with a neck that rose like a great, smooth serpent from the brown depths. They spoke of its brownish-gray skin, slick and hairless, and a tail that could crush a dugout canoe with a single, distracted flick. These were not the accounts of people trying to impress a traveler. These were the warnings of fishermen, who knew exactly which bends in the river to avoid if they wished to see the next sunrise. Perhaps the most chilling tradition comes from the 1959 encounter near the shallow, circular waters of Lake Telly. The Bangam people tell of a day when the creature's territorial nature finally collided with the needs of the tribe. According to the oral history, the creature was frequently seen entering a specific area of the lake, disturbing the fishing and terrifying the children. The people, driven by a mixture of desperation and communal fear, constructed a barrier of stakes across a narrow channel to trap the beast. When the Mokele-Mbembe attempted to break through, the hunters attacked. They describe a struggle that lasted for hours, a chaotic clash of wood, spear, and primeval fury. It is said they eventually killed the animal, and the elders speak of the strange, red hue of its blood and the peculiar snake-like head that seemed out of place on such a massive frame. But there was no celebration. Those who supposedly ate of the creature's flesh fell ill and died. A final, dark testament to the beast's supernatural status in their culture. The fear surrounding the Mokele-Mbembe is balanced by a strange sort of respect for its diet and habits. The local people have long observed that while the beast is fiercely aggressive toward hippopotamuses and human vessels, it is a vegetarian. They point to the malambo fruit, a thick-skinned, tart fruit that grows on lianas along the water's edge, as its favorite sustenance. In the 1960s, guides would often show explorers these fruit-bearing vines that had been stripped clean at a height no elephant could reach. To the Baka and the F, the creature is a guardian of the deep swamps. It does not hunt for meat, it hunts for peace. It kills the hippos not for food, but because they compete for space in the cool, shaded river bends. This distinction, a peaceful herbivore that is also a violent protector of its home, is a recurring theme in the voices from the riverbank. It paints a picture of a creature that is simply part of the ecosystem, a heavy, breathing shadow that demands the jungle be left as it is. As we drift further into the evening, the sounds of the jungle intensify. The chirp of insects and the distant splash of a rising fish create a tapestry of noise that the local people interpret as a language of its own. They believe that the Mokele-Mbembe lives in the caves carved by the river into the clay banks at sharp turns, resting in the cool darkness while the sun is high. In the mid-20th century, these stories were the only evidence we had, and for the people of the Congo, they remain the most vital. To them, a footprint in the mud is less important than the collective memory of a village that has lived beside the monster for 1,000 years. The oral traditions are the true guardians of the Mokele-Mbembe, keeping it alive in the mind even when the physical world refuses to offer up its secrets. We are walking in the footsteps of legends, guided by the whispers of those who have seen the river stop its flow. The transition from the cool, gray halls of the University of Chicago to the emerald embrace of the Congo Basin was more than just a change in geography. For Dr. Roy Mackle, it was a descent into a living mystery. In 1980, the professor set aside his laboratory slides and his comfortable tenure to face a wilderness that modern maps still struggled to define. Imagine the sensation of the air as he stepped into the heat, heavy, wet, and thick with the scent of damp earth, blooming jasmine, and the metallic tang of the river. The humidity was a physical weight, a reminder that the world he was entering operated on a different set of rules than the one he had left behind. He carried with him a notebook, its pages already beginning to curl, and a mind trained to seek evidence. Mokele was a man of science, a biologist who understood that the history of life is often a story of survival against all odds. He did not come to the jungle as a wide-eyed adventurer seeking a monster to slay, but as a researcher looking for a relic, a biological leftover from an era long thought past. To his colleagues back home, the quest for a prehistoric beast in the heart of Africa seemed like a professional risk, a romantic diversion that threatened his credibility. But for Roy, the reports coming out of the Likwala region were too consistent to be ignored. He believed that the inundated swamps, which had remained largely unchanged for millions of years, might just be the perfect sanctuary for something ancient and forgotten by time. The journey truly began when the professor and his companion, James Powell, pushed their small boats into the Likwala-Oxherbs River. The water here was the color of strong tea, stained by the tannins of fallen leaves and the secrets of the mud. As they moved deeper into the northern swamps, the civilization of the trading posts faded, replaced by a wall of greenery so dense it seemed to press in from both sides. The sound of their motor was a jarring intrusion into a landscape that breathed with its own rhythm. The clicking of insects and the constant, low hum of life vibrating in the heat. Mokele watched the banks, noting the tangled vines of the Malambo plant, which the locals claimed was the favorite food of the beast. In the small, remote villages along the riverbanks, Mokele refined his methodology. He knew that leading questions could result in false reports, so he played a careful game of visual identification. Sitting on low wooden stools in the flickering light of a communal fire, he would open a book filled with sketches of animals from all over the world. He showed the villagers pictures of lions, giraffes, and even North American bears. When he showed them a picture of a rhinoceros, the villagers would shake their heads. The rhino did not live in these deep swamps. But when his fingers turned the page to the silhouette of a sauropod, a long-necked, heavy-bodied dinosaur, the atmosphere would change instantly. The elders would point, their eyes widening with recognition, and speak the name, Mokele-Mbembe. The descriptions provided by the witnesses were strikingly uniform. They spoke of a creature with skin like a plum, a dark, reddish-brown hue that was smooth and hairless. It was said to be the size of an elephant, yet its body was lower to the ground, supported by 4 powerful legs. The most striking feature was always the neck, long, flexible, and ending in a small, snake-like head. Some witnesses even described a strange frill or a crest, like a rooster's comb, that ran down the back of its head. As Mokele sat with the people of the Likwala, he realized they were not describing a ghost. They were describing a physical animal with specific habits, like submerging in the deep pools at the river curves to avoid detection. The name itself, Mokele-Mbembe, translates in the Lingala language to one who stops the flow of rivers. It is a title that evokes the sheer mass of the creature. The locals shared stories of the animal's immense power, claiming that it was territorial and would aggressively defend its home against any who dared to intrude. They spoke of a time in 1959 when a creature had supposedly been killed near Lake Telly after it had blocked a fishing weir. For the professor, these accounts formed a tapestry of evidence that felt more substantial than any blurry photograph. He could almost see the creature in his mind's eye, a great, silent sentinel of the wetlands, moving through the mist of the early morning, its neck breaking the surface. As the 1980 expedition pushed closer to the legendary Lake Telly, the physical toll on the team began to mount. The professor's boots were perpetually wet, and the relentless humidity made every movement an effort. Yet the scientific fire within him only grew. He was standing on the edge of a world that time had forgotten, a place where the fossil record might still be breathing. He knew that the odds were against him, that a single man stood little chance of finding a solitary beast in hundreds of square miles of trackless swamp. But the testimonies he had gathered and the unwavering conviction of the guides kept him moving forward. As the sun dipped below the canopy, Mokele felt a profound sense of being on the cusp of discovery. By September of 1981, the humid air of the Congo basin vibrated with a renewed purpose. While previous efforts had faltered against the jungle, Herman Regusters, an aerospace engineer, approached the mystery with technical precision. He arrived with his wife, Kia Warren, determined to map the unmappable. They pushed past the edges of the known world, entering the Likuala region where maps were merely suggestions of green and brown. The transition from flowing rivers to the stagnant swamp was an agonizing process. Each mile was a hard-won victory against a landscape that resisted human presence. The water was dark, stained by tannins of rotting leaves, and the air was so heavy with moisture that breathing felt like swallowing the atmosphere itself. The Likuala swamps are a place where time has been folded and tucked away. Here, the heat is a physical weight, pressing down on the shoulders of those brave enough to enter. During the day, temperatures soared toward 30 degrees Celsius, but the humidity made it feel far more oppressive. It is a world of glacials, saturated soils that suck at the boots of travelers, threatening to pull them into the ancient muck. Everywhere there are floating prairies, mats of vegetation so thick they support a person, yet so deceptive that one wrong step leads to a plunge into sunless depths. The swamp is never silent. It is a symphony of buzzing insects and rhythmic dripping from the high canopy. At the center of this emerald labyrinth lies Lake Telly. From above, it is a perfect circle, a strange eye looking at the sky. It is shallow, but its bottom is lined with a deep layer of peat accumulated over eons. The isolation of this lake cannot be overstated. It is surrounded by hundreds of miles of nearly impenetrable forest, creating a biological fortress where a creature from a forgotten age could persist undisturbed. For Regusters, the lake was the finish line, but reaching it required navigating the meandering Likuala Oxherbs River, which twisted like a serpent through the plains. The isolation is psychological, the feeling of being the only humans for an eternity in any direction, frays the nerves of even seasoned explorers. On the calm surface of Lake Telly, the legend finally took form. One afternoon, while Regusters and Kia were navigating the southernmost lobe in their inflatable raft, the stillness shattered. Approximately 30 feet away, a long, graceful neck broke the surface of the tea-colored water. It rose several feet, topped with a small, snake-like head moving with slow curiosity. They watched in suspended breath as the creature regarded them. There was no violent movement, just a quiet, cold reptilian stare that bridged the gap between the modern world and the prehistoric. The creature remained visible for what felt like an eternity before slipping back beneath the surface, leaving behind only expanding ripples and a silence heavier than before. The evidence was not limited to sight. On the morning of November 4th, at exactly 11:45, the team experienced something etched into their memories. As they explored the thicket, an extraordinary and terrifying sound erupted. It began as a low, windy roar, a sound coming from the earth itself, before escalating into a deep-throated, trumpeting growl. It was a vocalization that matched no known animal. It wasn't the grunt of a hippopotamus or the trumpeting of an elephant. Regusters captured this on tape, a haunting recording vibrating at a frequency near 500 hertz. The sound of something massive crashing through the brush followed, a rhythmic thudding suggesting a weight far beyond anything seen in the wild. Beyond sounds and sightings, the swamp yielded physical traces. In the muddy banks, the team discovered footprints that defied easy explanation. These were large, three-clawed tracks pressed deep into the clay. The local guides, men who lived in the shadow of the Likuala, identified them as the marks of the Mokele-Mbembe. These prints were nearly 3 feet in diameter, suggesting an animal of immense proportions, perhaps 35 feet in length. While skeptics point to misidentified elephant tracks, for those in the oppressive heat of the shore, the evidence felt undeniable. They attempted to capture the creature on film, but the harsh conditions, the moisture and dim light, rendered the photographs grainy and underexposed, leaving the world with only shadows of what they claimed to have seen. The 1981 expedition remains a significant chapter in the hunt for the Congo dinosaur. Herman Regusters returned to the United States with recordings and stories, sparking a firestorm of debate. He spoke of a world that time had forgotten, where the rules of extinction seemed not to apply. Yet, as with all things in the Likuala, the truth remained just out of reach, shrouded in mist and dense green curtains. The expedition highlighted the ultimate paradox of the Mokele-Mbembe. In a place so remote and hostile to human intrusion, the absence of absolute proof is not necessarily the proof of absence. The heart of the Likuala remains a vast, unblinking eye, guarding its secrets beneath the surface of Lake Tele. By the time 1987 arrived, the world was changing. The analog age was reaching its peak, and the hunt for the Mokele-Mbembe had shifted from the journals of solitary explorers to the lenses of professional film crews. There was a sense in the air that the mystery was finally close to being solved. Technology, once a luxury in the deep Congo, was now compact enough to be carried into the humid heart of the Likuala swamp. A Japanese film crew, driven by the same curiosity that had pulled others before them, set their sights on Lake Tele. They did not come with just rumors or sketches. They came with cameras, intending to document the reality of a living dinosaur for a global audience. The heat that year was oppressive, a thick blanket of moisture that clung to the skin and fogged the glass of their expensive equipment. But the promise of the unknown kept them moving forward through the tangled vines and murky waters. The expedition was a logistical marvel for its time. Unlike previous efforts that relied solely on ground travel through the dense, sucking mud of the swamps, this team utilized a small aircraft to gain a perspective that had eluded so many others. They understood that Lake Tele was a vast, shallow mirror, surrounded by a fortress of green canopy that hid its secrets well. From the air, the lake looked like a silver coin dropped into a sea of emerald. The hum of the engine was a jarring, mechanical rhythm against the ancient silence of the jungle below. For days, they flew patterns over the water, the cameramen straining their eyes through the viewfinders, hoping for a break in the surface. The water of the lake is famously opaque, filled with suspended sediment and decaying organic matter, making it impossible to see what might be lurking just inches beneath the surface. They were looking for a wake, a ripple, or a shadow that did not belong to the clouds or the birds. It was during one of these aerial sweeps that the unthinkable happened. As the plane banked low over the northern edge of the lake, a technician noticed a disturbance. It wasn't the small splash of a jumping fish or the steady glide of a crocodile. It was something larger, something that moved with a heavy, purposeful grace. The camera began to roll, capturing 15 seconds of footage that would soon ignite a firestorm of international debate. In the original recording, the colors are muted by the haze of the atmosphere and the limitations of 80s film stock. The water appears as a dark, olive green, and then, cutting through the stillness, a dark silhouette emerges. It is a grainy shape, moving steadily across the frame. To the crew in the plane, it appeared to be a long, slender neck attached to a massive, submerged body, creating a distinct V-shaped wake that stretched out behind it like a funeral shroud. The footage is haunting in its lack of clarity. Because it was filmed from a distance, the details are lost to the grain of the film. You cannot see scales, nor can you see eyes. You see only the presence of something undeniable. The shape seems to rise several feet out of the water, tilting slightly as it navigates the center of the lake. For 15 seconds, the world of the prehistoric and the world of the modern era collided on a strip of magnetic tape. The crew watched in a state of suspended breath, the only sound the whirring of the camera and the steady thrum of the propellers. When the object finally submerged, it did so without a violent splash, simply vanishing back into the tea-colored depths, leaving nothing but the fading ripples and a profound sense of awe in its wake. They had come for proof, and they had returned with a ghost captured in light and shadow. When the film was brought back to Japan and released to the public, the reaction was immediate and polarized. For cryptozoologists, this was the evidence they had spent decades waiting for. They pointed to the height of the neck, and the way the wake suggested a body far larger than any known aquatic animal in the region. They saw a sauropod, a relic of the Cretaceous period, surviving in the one place on Earth that time seemed to have forgotten. However, the scientific community was far more cautious. Skeptics spent hours analyzing every frame, zooming into the pixels until the image became a blur of gray and green. They proposed more earthly explanations. Some argued that the silhouette was nothing more than two men in a traditional wooden canoe, with one standing in the front to pole through the shallow water. From a height, the perspective could easily trick the eye into seeing a single, long-necked creature instead of a boat and its pilot. Another theory emerged, perhaps more plausible but no less fascinating. Some suggested the film had captured a swimming forest elephant. These smaller, elusive cousins of the bush elephant are known to cross the lakes of the Congo, often submerging their entire bodies to stay cool or to reach aquatic plants. When they swim, they use their trunks as snorkels, holding them high above the water to breathe. In the grainy, low-resolution footage of 1987, a trunk held aloft could easily be mistaken for the neck of a dinosaur. The debate raged through scientific journals and television specials, but the footage itself remained stubbornly ambiguous. It was a Rorschach test for the soul. What you saw in the water depended entirely on what you believed was possible. For the Japanese crew, the experience was life-altering. They had seen something that moved with a weight and a speed that didn't match a canoe or an elephant in their minds. Decades later, the 1987 footage is still studied, though it has never provided the definitive answer the world craved. It remains a grainy silhouette, a flickering shadow of a mystery that refuses to be solved. The jungle has a way of swallowing the truth, just as it swallows the light of the midday sun. As we look back at those 15 seconds of film, we are reminded of the fragility of our observations. We see a shape in the water, and we reach for the most extraordinary explanation because the alternative, that we are alone in a world where everything has been mapped and named, is far more frightening. The Japanese expedition added a vital, albeit controversial, chapter to the legend of Mokele-Mbembe. They proved that even with the best technology of their time, the Congo still held its breath, keeping its ancient residents hidden just out of reach, deep within the dark, unmoving waters of Lake Tele. As the echoes of the 1987 footage faded into the archives of cryptozoology, a different kind of seeker emerged from the humid vale of the Congo. This was the era of Rory Nugent, an American writer and explorer who did not travel with the heavy equipment of a film crew, but with the quiet intensity of a man looking for a ghost. In the late 1980s, Nugent ventured deep into the Likwala swamp, a region that seems to exist in a different geological epoch altogether. The air here is so thick with moisture that every breath feels like a choice, and the canopy is so dense that the sun is often reduced to a pale, emerald glow. Nugent was not just hunting for a creature. He was immersing himself in a world that the modern age had forgotten. His journey was a slow, rhythmic progression through the mud and the reeds, guided by the stories of the people who called the swamp their home. He was a man who understood that to find something the world says does not exist, one must first lose themselves in the places where the map ends and the legends begin. The Likwala is a sensory labyrinth. Nugent spoke of the smell of decaying vegetation, a sweet and heavy scent that clings to the skin like a second layer. He described the sounds of the jungle as a constant, vibrating wall of noise, the screech of gray parrots, the distant, booming calls of monkeys, and the unsettling silence that falls just before a storm. In this isolation, the mind begins to play tricks. The shadows between the cypress knees seem to move, and the ripples on the water feel like the wake of something massive. Nugent traveled by dugout canoe, a narrow vessel that felt dangerously small against the vastness of the swamp. For weeks, he lived on what the land provided, consuming snails and snakes, stripping away the comforts of civilization until only the quest remained. He was moving toward Lake Telly, the legendary heart of the mystery, a body of water that the local tribes treated with a mixture of reverence and absolute terror. To them, the lake was not just a place on a map. It was a sanctuary for a god that did not wish to be disturbed. When Nugent finally reached the shores of Lake Telly, he found a landscape that felt frozen in time. The water was the color of dark, oversteeped tea, perfectly still and reflecting the ancient trees that leaned over its edges. It was here, in the quiet heat of the late 80s, that the man who saw too much finally had his encounter. He was scanning the horizon, his eyes tired from weeks of searching, when he noticed something breaking the surface of the lake. It was not the jagged back of a crocodile or the rounded snout of a hippopotamus. Instead, it was a dark, slender shape that rose nearly 6 feet into the air. He described it as a periscope, a long, elegant neck topped with a small, snake-like head. It moved with a grace that seemed impossible for a creature of its size, cutting through the water without creating a splash. For several minutes, the world went silent. Nugent watched, breathless, as the prehistoric silhouette drifted across the center of the lake, a living relic of a world that should have vanished 65 million years ago. The physical description he gave was hauntingly specific. The neck was thick at the base and tapered toward a head that seemed remarkably small in comparison to the submerged mass he could only imagine beneath the surface. The skin appeared dark and wet, glistening under the muted light of the swamp. It did not behave like a known animal. It possessed a stillness, a watchful quality that suggested it was as aware of Nugent as he was of it. He reached for his camera, his hands shaking with the realization that he was witnessing the impossible. He managed to snap 2 photographs, but the distance and the haze of the swamp rendered the images blurry and indistinct. To the critics, they would be nothing more than logs or shadows. But to Nugent, standing on the edge of that forgotten lake, the camera was an afterthought. He was seeing the god-beast, the Mokele-Mbembe, and the sight was burning itself into his memory with a clarity that no film could ever capture. As Nugent urged his guides to paddle closer, hoping to close the gap and find the definitive proof the world demanded, the atmosphere turned cold. His local guides, men who had spent their lives in the shadow of the lake, suddenly stopped. They refused to move an inch closer to the creature. When Nugent insisted, the tension escalated until he found himself staring down the barrel of a gun. The guides were clear. The god can approach man, but man must never approach the god. To them, the creature was not a biological curiosity to be studied or photographed. It was a sacred presence that commanded a lethal respect. They would rather kill the explorer than allow him to commit the sacrilege of bothering the beast. Nugent was forced to sit in the stillness of his canoe, watching as the long neck slowly submerged, sinking back into the black depths of Lake Telly without a sound. The sighting was over, but the psychological journey was only just beginning. Returning from the heart of the Congo is a slow process of decompression, but for Rory Nugent, the return was particularly painful. He carried with him the weight of the witness, the burden of knowing something to be true that everyone else would dismiss as a delusion. In the years that followed, he wrote of his experiences in his book, Drums Along the Congo, but the skepticism of the scientific community was a heavy tide to swim against. He became the man who saw too much, haunted by a single afternoon on a remote lake where the rules of biology seemed to suspend themselves. The toll was not just one of frustration, but of a profound, lingering isolation. When you have looked into the eyes of the prehistoric past, the modern world begins to feel thin and artificial. Nugent did not just lose his belief in the limits of the known world. He lost his ability to ever truly leave the swamp behind. The Mokele-Mbembe remained in the water, but it also remained in his mind, a dark shape moving just beneath the surface of his every thought, forever out of reach, yet undeniably there. The humid air of the Congo basin does more than just weigh upon the lungs. It actively works to erase the past. In the Likuala swamps, the earth is not a quiet graveyard where history is preserved in cold stone. Instead, it is a vast, humid digestive system. When a giant falls in these woods, whether it be an elephant, a hippopotamus, or something far more ancient, the jungle begins its work immediately. Within months, the scavengers have stripped the flesh. And within years, the intense acidity of the soil and the tea-colored swamp water have dissolved the very calcium of the bones. This chemical hunger of the landscape is the first great hurdle in our search for the Mokele-Mbembe. To find a skeleton here would be a miracle of geology. The absence of a physical specimen is not just a failure of the explorers, but a testament to the aggressive efficiency of the ecosystem itself. We are looking for ghosts in a place that leaves no footprints in time. As we moved into the decade of the 1990s, the search for the creature shifted. The romantic, swashbuckling expeditions of the previous century gave way to a more desperate, almost feverish need for biological proof. In 1992, a Japanese film crew took to the skies above Lake Tele. From their circling aircraft, they captured 15 seconds of footage that would haunt cryptozoology for decades. The film showed a dark shape moving through the water, leaving a heavy, V-shaped wake that suggested a creature of immense weight and power. But even this, captured with the best technology of the time, remained a grainy silhouette. In the same year, and again throughout 1995 and 1996, explorers like William Gibbons pushed deeper into the hidden tributaries of the Jaw River. They were no longer just looking for a glimpse of a long neck. They were hunting for a tooth, a scrap of skin, or a single strand of hair that could be subjected to the emerging wonders of genetic testing. During these 1990s expeditions, the biological arguments against a prehistoric survivor became more pointed. Many scientists began to suggest that the Mokele-Mbembe might be a biological echo, a folk memory of the black rhinoceros. Though the rhinoceros is no longer found in the heart of the Congo, fossil evidence and historical records suggest they once roamed the peripheries. To a community that has not seen a rhino in generations, the description of a thick-skinned, three-toed beast with a single horn on its snout might slowly morph through centuries of storytelling. It becomes a water-dwelling monster, a creature that hates the hippopotamus and kills elephants. This theory aligns with the behavioral reports of the Mokele-Mbembe, which is often described as fiercely territorial. The rhinoceros is known for its poor eyesight and its tendency to charge anything it perceives as a threat. In the dim, dappled light of the swamp, a charging rhino and a mythical beast become one and the same in the eye of the beholder. Others looked toward the water for a more tangible candidate. The African soft-shelled turtle, known to science as Trionyx triunguis, can reach massive proportions. Some specimens grow to be over 3 feet long, with necks that are surprisingly flexible and snake-like. When these turtles bask on a submerged log, only their long, tapering heads and necks may be visible above the waterline. In the heat haze of a tropical afternoon, a large turtle moving through the reeds can easily be mistaken for the serpentine head of a dinosaur. There is also the monitor lizard, a predator that can grow to 6 or 7 feet in length. In the 1990s, researchers argued that if a giant, unknown species of monitor lizard existed in the deep swamps, it would explain the reptilian scales, the long tail, and the ability to vanish beneath the surface for long periods. These are the creatures of bone and blood that we know exist, yet they lack the prehistoric majesty that the world craves. The hardest biological wall to climb is the problem of a breeding population. For any species to survive from the age of the dinosaurs to the year 1999, it would require a population of at least several hundred individuals to avoid the trap of inbreeding and extinction. How could a group of animals that large, creatures the size of elephants, remain hidden in a world of satellite imagery and constant human encroachment. Skeptics argue that we should be finding a constant stream of carcasses, or at the very least, consistent sets of tracks that do not match the forest elephant. The expeditions of the late 1990s returned with plaster casts of footprints and sonar readings of large, submerged masses, but none of it was definitive. The sonar would show a shape, a shadow in the depths of the mud, but by the time the divers reached the spot, the water would be empty, leaving only the sound of the bubbles rising to the surface. Perhaps the Mokele-Mbembe exists in the space between the biological and the spiritual. In many local traditions, the creature is not a beast that can be shot or captured, but a spirit of the river that can pass through solid objects or vanish at will. When Western explorers arrive with their cameras and their sample kits, they are often chasing a physical manifestation of a metaphysical truth. The 1990s were a turning point where the mystery began to fracture. On one side was the cold, hard reality of the laboratory, demanding DNA and bone. On the other was the living folklore of the Congo, where the monster is a necessary part of the landscape, a shadow that reminds us that there are still places where the light of modern science cannot reach. We find ourselves standing on the edge of the water, looking at the ripples, wondering if the shadow we see is a relic of the past or simply the reflection of our own desire for wonder. As we move into the heart of the late 1990s and the turning of the new millennium, the air in the Congo basin seems to grow heavier, thick with a restless silence. The optimistic rush of the earlier decades, the era of bold claims and grainy photographs in the 1980s, began to collide with the jagged realities of a changing world. For those like Bill Gibbons, who dedicated years to tracing the Mokele-Mbembe, the path was no longer a simple biological puzzle to be solved with a lens. It was a test of endurance against a landscape that was rapidly closing its doors. The jungle, once seen as a static backdrop for discovery, was proving to be a living barrier that guarded its secrets with an increasingly jealous and heavy hand. The political landscape of the region shifted like the muddy, treacherous banks of the Sangha River. What historians call the Great War of Africa, the Second Congo War, erupted across the land, turning the heart of the mystery into a forbidden zone. The Likwala swamps, those vast expanses of ancient shadows, were suddenly surrounded by the echoes of a human struggle. For a long period, the trail of the beast seemed to vanish, swallowed by the chaos of shifting borders and the scarcity of safe passage. It was as if the animal itself, sensing the violent shift in the world above, had retreated even deeper into the lightless, submerged veins of the swamp where no human foot would dare to follow and no boat could navigate. By the year 2000, the search had to pivot. If the Congo was a closed book, explorers looked toward its neighbors, searching for the same story told in a different tongue. Bill Gibbons and his companions turned their gaze toward the southeastern corner of Cameroon. Here, among the Baka people of the deep forest, the legend lived under the name Mokele-Mbembe. Imagine the scene as the team traveled for 2 full days along dirt roads, so rutted they felt like dried riverbeds. When they arrived at the remote settlement of Welel, they were met by a heat that felt like a physical weight, smelling of damp earth and ripening forest fruits. The Baka spoke of the creature with a startling clarity. To them, it was not a ghost, but a rare, dangerous neighbor. During these expeditions in the early 2000s, the texture of the evidence changed from visual sightings to something more auditory and elusive. In November of the year 2000, the team trekked through the primary rainforest toward the Bamba River. They moved through a world where the sun almost never touches the forest floor, a place of perpetual emerald twilight. They gathered new reports of sightings from 1986 and as recent as April of the year 2000, but the physical trail was growing colder. The Baka elders noted a firm dwindle in the population of these animals lately. They told the explorers that the creatures were now remarkably hard to find, as if the spirit of the wild was thinning out, leaving behind only the hollow ghosts of what had once been. In 2001 and 2002, the search continued, yet the elements conspired against the hunters of the prehistoric. Low water levels turned deep pools into shallow mud flats, stripping away the creatures' hiding places. And yet the river remained empty of everything but reflections. The explorers spent weeks listening to the forest breathe. Near a location called Camp Catfish, south of the Nki Falls, the silence was shattered. It was not a sighting, but a sound, a deep, resonant bellow that vibrated through the humid air. 3 times the roar echoed from the west bank, a territorial call that sent the boatmen into a state of visible edge. But as soon as the sound of a motorized canoe approached, the forest snapped back into an impenetrable, defiant silence. This era represented the true vanishing of the trail. It was a period marked by the frustration of near misses and the realization that the world was shrinking. The untouched wilderness was being carved by the red clay scars of new logging roads. Between the year 2000 and the year 2016, over 23 million hectares of forest were lost to the saws. As the trees fell, sightings spiked in some districts, but their nature had changed. They were no longer peaceful observations, but the frantic encounters of animals pushed out of the shadows. The Mokele-Mbembe, once the king of the hidden waters, was becoming a memory etched into the fading ripples of a shrinking river, a survivor fleeing the sound of the axe. For Bill Gibbons, reaching his mid-50s during these treks, the physical toll was becoming as immense as the mystery. The journey involved 15-hour drives through the night and bouts of illness that forced teammates into hospitals in villages like Salapound. The trail was no longer a path of footprints. It was a mosaic of whispers and the sense that they were arriving at the water's edge just a moment too late. The creature remained forever just around the next bend, just beneath the lily pads, staying one step ahead of the modern world. The trail had not ended, but it was turning into a whisper, a low vibration in the mud that grew harder and harder to hear as the relentless march of the millennium moved forward into an increasingly loud and crowded unknown. As the sun dips below the jagged line of the forest canopy, the heat of the Congo basin does not truly leave. It merely softens, turning into a heavy, humid weight that settles over the winding tributaries like a damp, velvet cloth. We find ourselves now in the early years of the 21st century, a time when the world feels smaller, mapped by satellites and crisscrossed by invisible signals. Yet, for those who drift along the Bamba River or the dark, tea-colored waters of Lake Tele, the mystery of the Mokele-Mbembe remains as vast and impenetrable as it was 100 years ago. The torch of the search has passed from the hands of aging explorers like Bill Gibbons to a new generation of seekers, most notably the French investigator Michel Ballet. For more than 2 decades, Ballet has returned again and again to the dense green labyrinth of Cameroon and the Republic of the Congo. He does not come with the heavy-handed certainty of the early Victorian adventurers, but with a quiet, persistent patience. He moves through the undergrowth with a handheld camera and a deep respect for the silence of the swamp, looking for a ripple that does not belong to a crocodile or the heavy wake of a hippopotamus. The landscape itself is changing, even if the legend refuses to fade. The Congo Basin is often called the lungs of Africa, a primordial expanse that breathes in more than 1 billion tons of carbon dioxide every year, keeping the balance of our world in check. But these lungs are being squeezed. Between the years 2000 and 2016, more than 23 million hectares of forest were lost to the steady march of progress. As the trees fall and the settlements of man creep deeper into the emerald shadows, a strange phenomenon has begun to occur. Sightings of the creature known as the one who stops the flow of rivers are actually becoming more frequent. Conservationists like Laura Vlachova have observed that as the habitat shrinks, the distance between the human world and the wild world vanishes. In the village of Boha, and along the banks of the Sangha River, people are encountering large animals they have never seen before. A forest elephant, displaced and angry, crashing through the brush in the moonlight, can easily become a prehistoric giant in the mind of a witness primed by generations of folklore. The rustle of a monitor lizard, or the splash of a python, becomes the signature of something much older and much more terrifying. In 2016, a documentary film crew from South Africa spent 4 weeks navigating the treacherous Likuola swamp. They brought with them the latest technology, hoping that modern optics would succeed where film and Polaroids had failed. They interviewed the Aka people, the guardians of the forest who have lived alongside the mystery for centuries. What they found was a complex tapestry of belief. To some, the Mokele-Mbembe is a physical creature of flesh, bone, and reddish-brown skin. To others, it is a spiritual entity, a manifestation of the river's power that cannot be captured by a lens. One hunter told the crew that the beast had died at least 10 years prior, leaving behind only the ghost of its presence to haunt the river bends. Others insisted it was simply waiting, submerged in the deepest pools where the light of the sun never reaches. The crew captured many things on their journey: the haunting call of the hornbill, the shimmer of moonlight on the water, and the profound isolation of the swamp. But the creature itself remained a shadow just out of frame. It is as if the Mokele-Mbembe knows that to be seen is to be conquered, and it chooses instead to remain a whisper in the mist. Reflecting on the legacy of this long search, we must consider what the legend provides for us in a modern world that demands an answer for everything. Perhaps the Mokele-Mbembe is a necessary myth, a reminder that there are still places on this earth where the map is blank and the rules of biology are merely suggestions. The creature stands as a guardian of the unknown, a symbol of the resilience of the natural world against the encroachment of industry. Whether it is a relic sauropod that somehow defied the extinction of 65 million years ago, or a cultural metaphor for the untamable spirit of the Congo, its power over the human imagination is undeniable. We see this in the eyes of the fishermen, who refuse to cast their nets in certain stretches of the river after dark, and in the determination of explorers who spend their life savings just to breathe the humid air of the Likuola one more time. The mist on the water does not just hide a monster. It hides our own capacity for wonder, our deep-seated need to believe that the world is still full of secrets waiting to be whispered. Our journey through the damp corridors of the Congo now reaches its end. We have followed the tracks in the mud, listened to the bellows in the night, and felt the heartbeat of a forest that refuses to give up its children. The boats are being tied to the docks, the campfires are burning low, and the sounds of the jungle are settling into a rhythmic, soothing pulse. The water of the river continues to flow, ancient and indifferent, carrying with it the stories of those who saw something impossible and those who are still looking. The searchers may go home, their journals filled with questions instead of proofs, but the legend remains. It waits in the ripples, in the deep green shadows, and in the quiet spaces between the trees. The Mokele-Mbembe does not need us to find it to exist. It only needs the forest to remain wild and the rivers to keep moving toward the sea. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.